Hello, I'm Catherine Jean Lopez from the National Review Institute and National Review Magazine, and I'm delighted to have Alexander Rakin who's a researcher who has an article in the most recent issue of National Review called Canada's Ministry of Death: How the Euthanasia Lobby Conquered the Liberal Party in Canada. And I speak to you from New York State, and we're like an hour away by plane or less to the Canadian border. Canada is the euthanasia capital of the world, which is a little known reality. And in the piece, Alexander, that you write in National Review, you say that every day in Canada in 2021, more than 27 people died by the hands of their physicians or nurses. That's double the suicide rate in Canada. How on earth did we get to this place?
Well, that's kind of the million-dollar question, right? How did a country where 10 years ago, the House of Commons voted overwhelmingly against decriminalizing euthanasia and assisted suicide, how in multiple polls in 2010, Canadians, according to the polls, wanted to have more palliative care over a system of euthanasia, where the Supreme Court of Canada already ruled that euthanasia should remain criminalized. How did that change? Well, what I'm trying to say, and this is what I sort of talked about in the piece, is that there never was a consensus amongst Canadians that Canada should become the world's most permissive and largest system of euthanasia. There never was that consensus. And yet the government of Canada under Justin Trudeau was the first prime minister to administer this program, and he has remained prime minister ever since then. The government of Canada claimed that there was a consensus. Well, it never happened. It was engineered. It was backhanded shenanigans. So I talk about different expert panels that were essentially administered in a certain way, and they were chosen.
Totally one-sided.
Totally one-sided. The expert panels, medical associations, polling, all of that was taken over by a single lobby group for assisted dying. And that lobby group was funded by several multi-hundred millionaires. Now, look, they're not billionaires, but that's because we're dealing with Canada. You don't need as much money to buy out Canada as you do in the United States.
Well, I couldn't help but think it hasn't been as rapid or successful yet in the United States, but I thought of that dear woman, Brittany Maynard, who had brain cancer, who was on the cover of People magazine before she killed herself, after. And obviously Compassionate Choices, the euthanasia lobby here in the United States, wanted to make everyone believe that this is the only compassionate option when you're terminally ill. But of course, in Canada, you don't even have to be terminally ill. They're killing homeless people. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Right. So let's be clear, right? To die in Canada right now, right? You can die because you have hearing loss. Hearing loss is a valid reason to die in Canada. If you have diabetes, if you have tinnitus, if you have arthritis, if you have an easily treatable infection, all of that are considered reasons to die in Canada. So I actually wrote about this. So two things. So first of all, the strategy that Compassionate Choices uses is the same strategy that was used inside of Canada. Americans and Canadians, for better or for worse, are largely supportive of a specific form of assisted suicide, right? It's for someone who is in a terminal condition, who have tried everything, and there's nothing left to be done. But that's not really what they're pushing. And we've seen in every single system of euthanasia, it doesn't end there. So, I should also stress that I actually had another article that came out for the Washington Free Beacon, which looked at the Alzheimer's Association here in the US had a secret partnership with Compassionate Choices dedicated to improving end-of-life care to predominantly historically underserved communities, i.e. African Americans. Mm-hmm. So and again, if you're an assisted suicide lobby, effectively what they were doing is they were trying to promote assisted suicide to Black Americans, which they didn't want, and arguably they don't really need. So I had an article that came out, and within 24 hours, the Alzheimer's Association issued a press release saying that they did not do due diligence and that they severed their relationship with Compassion Choices. So I want to be clear about this. There are ways of fighting back against this. And the argument that they use, right, those stories of, and it seems to always be, of terminally ill white women, despite Canadian multiculturalism, those are the same stories that they use both in the US and Canada. Those are the most compelling stories, but that's not really what they're pushing. What they're trying to push is a permissive system of euthanasia where anyone, for any reason, can request euthanasia or assisted suicide, and a physician will grant it, right? So, they're completely upfront about this too, right? Both in the U.S. and in Canada. By the way, the head of the chief legal officer, that's the title, of Compassion Choices, right? The pro-assisted suicide lobby, the largest assisted suicide lobby here in the U.S. The head of the assisted suicide lobby, or sorry, not the head, let me rephrase this. The chief legal officer of Compassion Choices issued in an op-ed, in a response, that no one with a condition like, not arthritis, anorexia, that no one with anorexia will be able to qualify under America's jurisdiction for assisted suicide, right? Anorexia is not a terminal condition. Anorexia is a mental condition, right? All of those reasons. And by the way, people's depression obviously is correlated with not eating. So for all those reasons, no one with anorexia should qualify for assisted suicide. That was issued in 2022, so last year. Well, guess what? Also last year, we had people in the United States, in Colorado, multiple cases of people qualifying for assisted suicide because of their anorexia. Okay, so this is a clear-cut example of, well, saying one thing, but actually doing another. Obviously in Canada, because it was passed and because the Canadian government has been so pro-euthanasia and so pro-assisted suicide, the slippery slope is dead, right? We're already way beyond where critics warned would happen, right? Like Canadian veterans, when they're trying to seek medical care, seek help for their PTSD, there have been at least 4 or 5, but we know there's plenty more. There's been at least 4 or 5 verified cases where those Canadian veterans who served in Afghanistan, right, came back with PTSD from serving their country, are asking for help with their PTSD, and instead are being offered, hey, well, we can't really grant you that because we don't have the resources, but have you considered MAID, right? And that's medical assisted dying. It's a good euphemism because it completely removes the need to actually say what is happening, which is euthanasia of individuals who otherwise would have remained living. And in many cases are dying from medical conditions that are treatable, if not curable.
It's the total perversion of medicine, because as you were saying, Alexander, doctors are putting this idea in people's heads. And this should be the most trusted relationship there is. You know, you mentioned veterans, you mentioned the elderly, you mentioned anorexia victims. They're pushing, first of all, you write about a married couple, one of the spouses is terminally ill, and so we have a beautiful death together. No, that's not the way it's supposed to work.
Can I tell you what was a news report, when an article came out last week? So let me tell you 2 articles, just because it shows the complete perversion of Canada. Let me be upfront, right? I love Canada. I'm a Canadian citizen. I immigrated to Canada, okay? But what has happened, and there are plenty good Canadian physicians, lawyers, disability advocates, priests, members of faith groups, disability advocates who are fighting against this. So let's be clear. It's not, and I also want to be clear with my piece, is that this isn't what Canadians want. This isn't what the public wants, right? This has been orchestrated by a special lobby group infiltrating pretty much every single major Canadian institution. right? So I want to be clear about that, right? In terms of just the two news articles that came out last week, that was reported in Canada. One of the articles was about a couple who were married for 73 years, and they wanted to live together, but one of them needed to have more assistance. However, they were not granted assisted living at home, and they were forced to separate after 73 years of marriage because the assisted care home, right, was hours away from the other individual. They couldn't live together in the same assisted care home in Ontario. Okay, that's one story. The story that you're talking about is also of a married couple who were married for 73 years, and they were allowed to die together at home. That's the perversion of the system. The government of Canada is not going to give you the resources you need in order to keep a married couple who are of 73 years to live together, but they will give resources for them to die together. Right. And the reason that one of them seemingly died is because they were old. And we have that. We have evidence of that some Canadian physicians believe that a natural death that is reasonably foreseeable, which is one of the tracks for MAID in Canada, is reached by just being old. No other jurisdiction, no other euthanasia program has that requirement. It was rejected in Belgium. It was rejected in the Netherlands. In Japan, the idea that 75-year-olds could qualify for a system of euthanasia just because of their age and not because of a medical condition was considered dystopian enough that it was turned into a film and it won a special prize at Cannes. But in Canada, without any debate in Parliament or amongst physicians, this is happening. So that's story number one. Story number two is that, as you're probably aware, and if you're not, Canada next month, unless Parliament of Canada manages to pass a bill, people with only psychiatric conditions will qualify for death. Okay, people with only psychiatric conditions without any physical condition. There was a news report. So the government of Canada, because of all of the criticism, has now backtracked, and they're trying to implement that not next month, but in a year from now.
Hoping people will forget about it.
Well, essentially, I mean, it worked in the past, so why wouldn't it work now? So a news article came out, an op-ed came out in the Toronto Star, and I apologize if I start laughing about this, just because it's just so ridiculous. It's hard to comprehend. An op-ed came out in the Toronto Star where someone was talking about how they had a friend who was suicidal, and they convinced their friend not to commit suicide. Right? They pulled them back off the ledge, right? They told them that their life is worth living. And op-ed columnists took that story and decided to say that it's proof why MAID is important. Because, and this was the argument, if their friend now decided to ask for MAID, they would help drive them to the clinic. This is published in the Toronto Star. Right, so this is like a center-left publication in Canada. It's one of the most read newspapers in Canada. Right, this is the perversity of the system, right? And the people who are running this, right, it's not the public. Right. This is a publisher of a newspaper deeming which op-eds are important to run and which op-eds aren't. And they deem that this story is apparently going to convince people.
And trying to give the idea, the falsity that there's some consensus, as you said. I mean, the thing that is hopeful here is, I mean, I think of it akin to abortion in the United States. Polling consistently shows that people who describe themselves as pro-choice want to know that a woman in a difficult situation has options. There is a compassion to people's misguided view that if you have a terminal illness, you should be able to have doctor-assisted suicide. That's what gives me hope, because people don't know about palliative care, right? And that's the reason people will give in to assisted suicide.
People don't receive palliative care, right?
If so they even Canada, were offered April, it, right?
Yes. So in April of 2022, the Canadian Society of Palliative Care, they issued a memo, a letter to Parliament of Canada. And in it, they said that the percentage of Canadians who actually receive palliative care, who apply for MAID, is so low that if it was any other form of medicine, that this would be considered an ethical breach.
Wow.
This would be considered a medical violation if this was in any form, any other form of medicine. But because it's palliative care, and because the government has underfunded it, right, and instead is using MAID as a substitute for proper palliative care, right? Like, you don't need to suffer if you're dying. We have a form of medicine for this, right? This isn't a new invention, right? There's palliative care. There are ethical problems that go into it, but there are significant alternatives where people can live dignified lives and die a dignified death without a physician ending their life. But it's not funded in Canada properly.
Well, we think about the Hippocratic Oath, which apparently is no more, right? I mean, I'm speaking to you. My mother is in the hospital right now, my 80-year-old mother, and I give thanks to God that her doctors seem to value her life. Because at a certain point, why bother with a surgery, a hospital might say, because it's not economically advantageous, right? Again, I sorry to keep making parallels to abortion, but I think when Dobbs ended Roe versus Wade in the United States, all of a sudden, these companies were going to pay for women's abortions, and this is supposed to be good for women. No, it's good for your bottom line, right? Because she doesn't have to go on maternity leave now. It's just so obvious in one respect, but because, you outline in the piece in National Review how the Supreme Court is to blame, and the politicians are to blame, and the media is to blame, and the medical system is to blame, because everybody sort of ignored the facts. And in a particular way, you mentioned, Alexander, that they seem to highlight white women and ignore the disability groups, for instance, to ignore, as you were pointing out, the Black people. Again, I'm thinking of Planned Parenthood and its roots in eugenics. We're not supposed to talk about that, but that's how abortion really became mainstreamed in America.
That's how, let's be clear. I think that there are a lot of parallels with the eugenics movement in the 1920s and 1930s with assisted suicide and euthanasia, right? Katrin Frazee, who is a wonderful disability scholar, she's retired now, but she's from the University of Toronto. She wrote, and she said to Parliament, a very moving article, which was, why us? Why is it that the only people who qualify for assisted suicide are people with disabilities? Right? Everyone else, right? How's the show? Like, God forbid if you, needs, you're feeling suicidal, right? But the government will take away your gun if it deems that you're a threat to yourself, right? The government would take away your barbiturates. The government will push you away from the edge, right? The government will even sometimes forcibly institutionalize you if you're feeling suicidal, if you're feeling depressed, right? You would be connected with resources that you need to live. And yet, if you have disabilities, right? In Canada, if you have diabetes, sorry, there's a program available only for you, right? That will end your life seemingly painlessly. As in my New Atlantis piece, one of the MAID providers described it as an elegant, graceful, dignified death, only for people with disabilities, right? And if there's any consolation from this fact, is that we won this fight before, right? Forcible sterilization existed in North America. In the United States, the state of Indiana in 1907. By the 1930s, over 50% of American states had forcible sterilization. The only province, or the only state in the British Empire which had forcible sterilization was the province in a large scale, was the province of Alberta. And they had, at first, they had a consensual model in 1927. By 1931, that proved to be too onerous. So they removed the consensual requirement, the requirement for consent. And we kind of see the same thing in Canada today, where you have physicians, like from the Quebec Medical College, advocating for infanticide. Well, I'm sorry, but babies under 1 year old, they can't really consent. So the bottom line is that we won those fights, right? Disability groups, faith groups, moral individuals, right, realize that, well, there's no medical therapeutic reason to sterilize someone. Well, the same way, there's no medical therapeutic reason to end the life of anyone, let alone someone who is not dying, right? These are
Someone
fights
who's
that can't be
lonely.
won. Yes.
People who are lonely are being killed in Canada.
Yes. Yes. Again, you need to have some sort of medical pretext, but you can create your own medical pretext.
Well, and you talked about the psychological, where Canada's going now. It's actually been argued that it would be discrimination to say that, oh, someone with a psychological problem can't die, but someone with a physical problem can.
And yet they're completely immune. They completely ignore the other element of discrimination, which is that if you're not disabled in Canada, you are not given the right for an assisted death. Right? Like the element of eugenics in this is just so clear cut, right? Hearing loss is not a valid reason to die.
Right.
Any physician who says so should not be a physician, right? And yet, for this system, if someone has credit card debt and they have a hearing loss, and maybe they have depression, well, go right ahead, right? You are not given the same resources here.
You write about in your National Review piece how there's no mandated process for reporting potential abuse. That's shocking. I mean, this is all shocking, but obviously, I mean, there's no check.
Right. When I started this, I didn't think I would have a conspiratorial mindset. But why isn't there a review process? Belgium and Netherlands, the only other countries with mass euthanasia programs similar to Canada, right? They have a review process. There is no review process. So you want to know who actually is doing the review process right now? It's not the government. They're disability advocacy groups. They're the ones who are compiling a list of cases of concern, right? And the names on it, there are dozens and dozens of names on it, dozens and dozens of stories. No one is reviewing it. The police aren't interested. The coroner's report isn't interested in it. Canadian media, they're really not interested in it, right? They might report, and let's be clear, there are some really great Canadian journalists who've been studying this and who've been investigating this. Someone like Abbas Stavro from CTV. But Canadian media is only really interested in these local stories, seemingly connecting the dots. If this was any other story, right, where you have dozens and dozens and dozens of cases, right now it's almost weekly, right, if not even daily, of potential cases of abuse that are like filtering out, right? Any journalist would connect these dots together. Any human being would connect these dots together, right? These aren't isolated cases. And yet, not really, no.
There was a small blip at the end of last year where the Associated Press reported on this. And I thought, oh my goodness, this is going to be the end. But it kind of lost traction.
Yes. Yeah, look, for a fact, right, for the reporting that I did for like the New Atlantis, right, for a fact, the Canadian Association of MAID Assessors and Providers, who are so they're like a group of Canadian physicians who perform euthanasia, right? They're the ones who are being paid by Health Canada to develop training standards for themselves. For a fact, they have lied to Parliament. They have lied to the public when they said that no one is requesting MAID because of a lack of housing. It is untrue. And we know that it is untrue. because, well, they had whole seminars on exactly that topic, right? And you can see this also in the expert panels, right? Like the logic of these sort of biased expert panels, where the government of Canada decided to stack them very clear cut with people who are pro euthanasia, and then they use that then as a sort of justification for increasing, for not well, first of all, for reducing the number of safeguards, which they've already done, and also for increasing the potential excuses for euthanasia, right? Like, it's so clear cut. The bias is evident, but you can't ignore reality, right? People are dying in Canada who should not be dying. And they're dying from reasons that are societal, not medical. So even if you're someone who believes that euthanasia is permissible, right? They're not dying for medical reasons. The M in MAID is medical. They're not dying from that. They're dying from all of these other reasons. And they're dying because we've already have so many cases of people with disabilities, right, being pressured or feeling that they're being pressured into ending their lives by their physician, right? This is on a societal level, and this is also on a personal level. And this is going to keep happening. And it's going to keep happening until something is done about this. Now, I'm confident that there's going to be court cases on this, both locally, both inside of Canada and internationally. I'm confident that as the public learns more about this, which is finally being, as you said, it's finally coming out, that next election, they're going to speak out about this. The Conservatives in Canada, so the Conservative Party, has said that no one should receive MAID purely because of psychiatric condition. That's a good step, right? It's not exactly undoing Bill C-7, which made that essentially if you have any chronic illness, you could qualify for MAID. But that's a good step. That's the first sign we've ever had of someone taking a stance.
You make the point in your National Review piece that Justin Trudeau has been on the cover of GQ, which we won't talk about, but he's this celebrity.
That's Gentleman Quarterly, by the way, if you're interested.
I'm not a subscriber, but I don't think you are either. But it's never mentioned that this is actually his legacy.
Yes.
I mean, a global legacy. Oh
my gosh, sorry. This is what the most peeves me off. Can we use that language?
Yes.
Peeves. This is what peeves me off more than anything else, right? Is that international media really only started getting interested in this in 2021. Okay. By 2020, Canada already had the world's largest euthanasia program. Okay. They've been very late to this party. Now, again, Canadian media has been even, it's still queuing for the party. So they're not even inside, right? But this is Justin Trudeau's legacy. He has single-handedly created the largest system of euthanasia, the most permissive system of euthanasia, where over 140 disability advocacy groups wrote before the latest expansion that this bill and this government is putting their lives at risk. Turns out the warnings were completely true, because that is exactly what ended up happening. Like, there are stories and stories of people being euthanized because they can't get the medical care they need, or because they have credit card debt, or because they're lonely, or because they have depression and they can't see a psychiatrist. You want to know what the wait time is to see a next level of psychiatric care, right? So if you go to a psychiatrist, they can't help you. You want to go to the next level of psychiatric care. In Ontario, the wait time is 5 years. Okay, 5 years. Remember, depression is a neurodegenerative disease. The longer that your depression is untreated, the harder it is to treat. That said, there's almost an infinite number of ways to treat depression, right? Whether it's from, we don't need to get into that, right? There are many ways, potential ways to treat depression. Well, unless you're Richard Hananey. If you're Richard Hananey, he was someone who was tweeted out, why do we have suicide hotlines when we don't have murder hotlines? Which, by the way, we do have murder hotlines. It's called 911. Okay, sorry. Okay, staying on topic. So 5 years to see a psychiatrist, right? If you want to get an appointment for medical assistance in dying in Canada, well, I looked into it. I'm a Canadian citizen. I called the Ontario hotline. Never in my life have I ever called a bureaucratic hotline and I've been able to speak to someone within 30 seconds.
Oh my goodness.
And I was speaking to a bureaucrat, 30 seconds, called 1 p.m. on a Monday. I thought it would be busy. It wasn't. She didn't ask me any questions about my medical condition. She didn't ask me any questions about trying to get me to the medical support that could save my life or could help me in any way. All that she said is she connected me with a nurse. The nurse calls me back that exact same day, okay, 5 hours later, and asked me if I'm interested in having my first appointment in medical assistant dying, which would be in 2 weeks. Right? 2 weeks to see, I can't even see my family doctor in Ontario in less than 2 weeks, right? But I can see a physician or a nurse practitioner to assess me. So for the first appointment in 2 weeks. And again, if you have a natural death that is reasonably foreseeable, which is an extremely loose term, right? I'll give it just a brief anecdote because I think it summarizes the differences in the value of life between Canada and the United States that we see right now. So as part of my piece for the Washington Free Beacon, I interviewed Dr. Epps. She is a professor of nursing at Emory University, and she deals with the African American community with dementia and Alzheimer's. So she has been very vocal about this. She has created a program partnering with historically Black churches about this. And I asked her a question about like what are the cares and services that your patients who are end of life need. And you know what she told me? She told me she doesn't consider her patients to be end of life. Yes, she deals with patients who have Alzheimer's, but with an Alzheimer's diagnosis, you can live for 5 to 15 years, right? You're not end of life. And in fact, many of those patients, if not most of them, despite, obviously the huge anxiety and stress of first being diagnosed with Alzheimer's, right? There are many positive moments in their lives, right? Where they can assess, right? Where they can come to grips with their disease, where they can have dignified moments, right? Connecting with family, right? Where they are human beings with value, with dignity, and they can live dignified lives for years. She does not consider her patients end of life. In Canada, and this is why I told her, in Canada, as soon as you have your Alzheimer's diagnosis, you qualify for an assisted death immediately. As soon as you have 2 assessments from any physicians or nurse practitioners, you qualify without any legislative delays to die, right? Even though you might potentially have 15 years left. Even though you, as we know, right, for people who have recent physical illnesses, the suicidality of those illnesses diminishes over time, right? As people come to grips with physical illnesses, whether it's chronic or terminal, right? Over time, people realize that they can actually live with this and they can live dignified lives with it. Well, in Canada, many people now don't get the chance to do that. What they do get the chance is for a publicly funded physician to end their lives. And the only drugs that are universally covered in Canada, right? Canada doesn't have pharmacare, but the only drugs that are universally covered are the drugs that will end your life.
Years ago, I did a panel, and one of our panelists was my friend Sister Constance from the Little Sisters of the Poor, who people will remember from a famous Supreme Court case not long ago. And Sister Constance now, I think, has been a sister for 20 years. And she said they care for the elderly poor who are terminal. Never, ever, ever has she seen someone in one of their homes who is begged to die, because they pour on love. They make sure there are resources. They make sure that they're not suffering. Obviously there's some level of suffering, but as we mentioned, there's palliative care. There are so many options. It's 2023. We should make use of all of these options. But it's so cruel not to make these available to people.
Right. So the reasons that people choose to die because of euthanasia, and now we have plenty of experience, right? Unfortunately, in Oregon, in Washington, in Canada, in Belgium, and Netherlands, it's not because of physical pain. It's not because of physical pain. The reasons why people choose to die is because they feel like they're a burden on themselves, their loved ones, and the medical system. Which, can we just mention just how messed up the latter point is,
Right.
right? That you're a burden to the medical system that you paid your entire life into,
Right.
right? Even in the
But
US,
also, what's the
right?
purpose of family if it's not to care for one another, right?
Exactly, right? That, so it's feelings of being a burden, and it's fear. It's fear of pain, right? It's loneliness, it's isolation, right? All of those things can be cured without killing the patient. All those things aren't terminal. All of those things are remediable, right? Loneliness should not be a reason that people die. And yet, as soon as you decriminalize euthanasia, we have seen a massive growth, right? We've seen a tenfold increase in number of deaths in euthanasia in Canada between 2016 and 2021, right? That is a tenfold growth. That's an increase of 1,000%. And by the way, the number of suicides in Canada have not dropped during that time. They've remained largely the same.
Well, and I would argue if people are being killed because they're lonely, that's an indictment on our culture, on our civil society. What is it they're not able to tap into that these doctors are able to put this in their head so swiftly, And I hate to be so American centric, but again, what you described, making that phone call and getting connected so quickly, less than an hour plane ride from New York, which we believe to be the capital of the world. Thank you very much. I would love to talk to you for hours, to be honest with you, but we should probably wrap it up. And my question would be, so what is your message to Canadians listening to this? And what's your message to Americans who are not quite there yet, but we could get there?
So let's start with Canadians, right? The only way that this will be changed is from your action, right? Let's be clear. We know that the system isn't working. This isn't a secret. This has been known for years. We know that people are dying who weren't meant to die, according to the Supreme Court of Canada, right? We know that, there's going to be some form of legal, in the immediate future, there's going to be some form of euthanasia and assisted suicide. The best way to save human life is to contain it. And contacting your MP, contacting your senator will help in actually controlling this. Right? What we need, every step of the way, the assisted suicide and euthanasia lobby has won every single battle. Every single battle. They won to decriminalize it. They won in expanding it to people beyond terminal cases. They wanted to expanding way beyond terminal cases to just about anyone with a chronic illness. They won the battle to expand it, to add a sunset clause, to expand it to people with only psychiatric conditions, right? They've won every stage of the battle. And the reason why is because they're well organized, right? Right now, the government of Canada clearly doesn't care about the lives of people with disabilities. The way to change that is by calling your MP, calling your senator, and letting them know that actually the Canadian public does value human life.
Do not be silent.
Do not be silent. Do not be silent. Plenty of, again, as I mentioned before, there are plenty of Canadians. I think the clearest example that this is not supported by a majority of Canadians is if you look at the number of physicians and nurse practitioners that actually perform euthanasia, it has remained virtually the same. It has remained around 1,200 physicians and nurse practitioners. This is a tiny, tiny fraction of the medical field. The problem is that the physicians who do perform it and the nurse practitioners who perform it love their jobs very, very much. And they perform euthanasia at an extremely high rate. They even suffer moral distress from the work because they perform it so many times to so many people. So that's the first part, right? This is not supported by the public. Ultimately, it's going to be rescinded. And I'm more than confident that over time, the Supreme Court of Canada is going to realize that they made a huge mistake. And Canada should be a warning sign to other jurisdictions. So that's the first part. To Americans, It's that the exact same strategies that work in Canada are coming here. The systems of assisted suicide in the United States have already caused that exact same problem, that people are dying who weren't meant to die according to that original legislation. It's going to continue happening because euthanasia and assisted suicide does not have a propensity to stop. It continues expanding, and it continues encompassing more and more people at risk. Because the entire logic of assisted suicide is that you have people with a terminal illness who are suffering that need to die. The issue is that once you legalize it, right, you're telling people with terminal illnesses who just found out that they have a terminal illness that all of a sudden their physician is willing to give up on them, right? At the exact moment that they need the most support and the most care, they're told, by the way, I, a physician, right, am sitting beside you with a white lab coat and stethoscope, that actually your life doesn't really have that much value, right? Because only you qualify for euthanasia or assisted suicide. And let's be clear, with the Americans are opposed. Once Americans know what actually is happening with euthanasia and assisted suicide, they oppose it, right? I don't think, maybe I just think too highly of people, but I think the average Joe and Jane, right, don't want their grandparents to die from euthanasia because it costs the government too much to give them the supports they need. I don't think that they look at their neighbor who has disabilities, right, who has visible disabilities, and thinks that, hey, actually, let's give them the right to die. I think that what they need, and they know they need, is more medical care, right? We are so far removed from morality if we believe that a permissive and expansive system of euthanasia is going to be the solution to our medical care problems and woes, right? Especially in America with the, obviously a for-profit motive as well, right? It is much cheaper to give euthanasia, to administer euthanasia on individuals than it is to keep them alive. And look, the Alzheimer's Association had a secret partnership with Compassionate Choices. Once they were called out on it, they all of a sudden rescinded it. And I think we can see that with other associations, right? We should call out organizations like the California Medical Association for not standing up for people with disabilities. We should call out, or we can look at, for instance, the American Psychiatric Association, which did issue an official policy condemning euthanasia for non-terminal cases, right? So I think as Americans, we should be able to look at what is happening in Canada, at what is happening in Belgium and Netherlands, what's happening in Oregon and Washington, and realize that the system isn't working. And it's not because of the laws. It's not because, there weren't necessarily good intentions involved. It's because of the inherent practice of administering death as a medical treatment. Physicians shouldn't be part of this. Nurses shouldn't be part of this. Medicine should be as in the Hippocratic Oath. It should be to help patients live.
And do no harm.
By the way, the definition of euthanasia was coined by Francis Bacon. What he meant by euthanasia was what we largely consider to be palliative care. His idea before was that actually physicians should be at the bedside of people who are dying, right? Before that, it was looked kind of circumspect, right? If you're a physician and all of a sudden your patient dies, it kind of looks bad on the physician. But what he said is actually the physician should be part of it, right? They should be able to manage someone's death, right? Conclusion of that isn't the physician killing the patient, right? I think that's more than anything shows the modern barbarity that's involved in this, right? The Hippocratic Oath expressively excluded physicians from handling tools that lead to death, right? Before that, ancient Greek physicians, they could use both forms of medicine that could kill and medicine that could save. But that's not where modern medicine comes from. It came from physicians saying that they are only going to use life-saving medicine, and they will only use their skills to further people's lives.
Well, again, I think one of your key points is education. If people actually know what's going on, and the hopeful thing is that people don't know what's going on, and once they do, their reaction needs to be to stand up, to speak out, to push back. And I again think about abortion in America, where most people don't want a young single Black girl who's 17, who feels desperate, doesn't know what to have an abortion. But so many of the influences in our culture tell her to have an abortion. And once we start thinking about, okay, how can we help her actually make a choice for life, then the conversation changes. But we have to get there. And I have to thank you, Alexander Rakin, for helping us get there. You wrote a beautiful piece in the New Atlantis. You wrote for the Washington Free Beacon. And that was an example that Alzheimer's Association, look, we know what Compassion and Choices is. They knew what they were getting into, but you called them out. And so they backed away. And it was, in some ways as simple as that. Just calling out the facts, shedding light on what's going on. And so again, I thank you, Alexander. The piece at National Review is The Current Issue, Canada's Ministry of Death. You can access it at nationalreview.com. You can get a digital subscription. I think you can buy just a copy of the one piece, but I encourage you to get a digital or print subscription at nationalreview.com. Thank you again, Alexander. And I'm Catherine Dean Lopez from the National Review Institute. And this is the first in what I hope is a series, National Review in Focus, where we talk to an author of a magazine piece, a print magazine piece, that corresponds to the center I run at NRI, the Center for Religion, Culture, and Civil Society. So I think you hit on a bunch of those areas now. So thank you again, Alexander.
Pleasure is all mine.
Thank you.